When does the minute start? When do we start counting down?
Now.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Moses Kotane Institute virtual lecture. Today we have, okay, let me introduce myself first. My name is Advocate Elishe Mapipa. I am here today in my capacity as the chairperson of the Research Ethics Committee of the Moses Kotane Institute. We have a guest, a lecturer today, Professor Jamila Adam, who is the Deputy Chairperson of the Research Ethics Committee of the Moses Kotane Institute. She would give us a lecture on the guidelines for a successful ethical review. She is an expert, a research expert. She is learned in many areas. Because of time, I won't go too much into detail. She is currently serving DUT in her capacity as a professor and only serving Moses Kotane partly. Thank you. Over to you, Prof.
Okay, welcome colleagues, and thank you for being here. I'm going to have my video on for a while, and then when I do my presentation, I will put it off so it will be clear to you, because we do have interruptions if we leave it on all the time. And just to say that why I'm also, as I said, as Advocate Mapipa says, I am the deputy chair now for the Moses Kotane Institute, but I'm also the chairperson of the Durban University of Technology Research Ethics Committee. And it's and I've been in other research ethics committee. Just a little bit of introduction. I mean, I have been in other research ethics committee as well. I've been in the Mangosuthu University of Technology Ethics Committee, where I tried to sort their ethics committee out. I've been the chairperson of the Richfield Institute of Technology Ethics Committee. I've been part of the Mancosa Ethics Committee. So I've been all over Cancer Research Ethics Committee. So quite a number of different institutes that I have been on. And besides that, I've been on the HPCSAs for 10 years as well. So I've got a background on health research and social science and animal research all around. Okay, thank you so much for being here. And I'm going to put my video off because I know we've got short time. It's a Friday afternoon and we don't want to drag the session. And I don't want to be too long. Also, I just want to make it known to people, if you have any questions, you can actually write it on the chat, or while I'm presenting and you want to know something, just remember it's an informal session. You can talk, you can actually raise your hand, and then you can actually, I won't be able to see your hand when I'm doing my presentation, but Noktula is there and she will allow me to just stop and you can carry on with your questions. I'll be very happy to address it as I go on. Thank you so much for that. And I will start my presentation now if you don't mind. Okay, is it all right?
Yes, please proceed, Prof.
Thank you so much. I'll just get the video off and get my presentation up. Okay, can you see my screen, colleagues?
Yes, we can see it, Prof.
Perfect. Okay, so I'll just put it on PowerPoint presentation. Wow, that's even better because then you can see clearly. Okay, so as Advocate Mapipa says, my title is Guidelines for Successful Ethical Review. Why we decided we will have this now is to guide people on how to do their proposals, so they cover all aspects of ethical concerns. So when it serves at the ethics committee, then it goes through smoothly. So we rather have it now than later. We did have a meeting on, I think it was Wednesday afternoon, and we found there was some gaps, and we thought we'd rather have this presentation now. So when people do their research, they'll be able to make sure that they cover all the various ethical concerns. Thank you so much for that. And let's go to the next. What I'll do first is just give a little bit of background on the ethics, what ethics is about, and then I will go on to the our guidelines that you need to actually, cover when you're doing your research proposals. Thank you. Okay, what the role of the Research Ethics Committee is, just very briefly, you're probably aware of it already, but it's nice to know. The primary role of the Research Ethics Committee is protection of the rights and welfare of research participants. That includes individuals themselves and the communities as well, if you do research amongst communities as well. They provide the RECs also provide ethical advice to researchers to assist decision-making on adequacy of proposed research projects regarding participation protection. So also protection is very important. The Research Ethics Committees also serve to protect investigators and the institution from the unjust criticism, the litigation, etc. So it's participants, the researcher themselves, and the institution. They ensure research benefits society. The research should not be hindered in any way, okay? The review process that we are involved in, we make sure that there are no conflict of interest with when we start the meeting, we just declare that if there's any conflict of interest, and we do recuse ourselves if there is. The next thing is we review the research proposals according to national guidelines, and we have a discussion and deliberations regarding certain issues if we come across certain ethical aspects. And then we also, if we don't have the expertise in our team, we consult with the experts on the outside. So when we don't have in the committee, so we do liaise with people that are experts in that field. The benchmarks for ethical research, there's 8 very important benchmarks. That's you can see that there's a reference there where you can get it from, and they give you in detail on each aspect of this. Firstly, collaborative partnership is important, and next one is social value. The next thing is scientific validity. In other words, all these are very important aspects when you're doing your actual proposal as well. Make sure you cover all this. Fair subject selection, favorable risk-benefit ratio. There must be a favorable, in other words, the benefit must be higher than the risk. It must go through an independent review process, and you must get informed consent from the participants, and you must also make sure that their human subjects are respected. The fundamental principles of human research ethics review. Firstly is respect, as we said. The first thing is respect. Make sure that the participants are respected and they have their autonomy is maintained and they are protected. And it must be, beneficence is the next one. The next one is nonmaleficence and justice. What we mean by beneficence is benefit. It must be of benefit to the participants or the community or whatever else that you want to do. And then it must have no harm. It mustn't harm the participants in any way, the researcher or anyone, the community as well. Justice, it must be morally right and proper. It must be just, okay, the research that you would like to undertake. So the Research Ethics Committee actually reviews your proposals and make sure that these are maintained. As far as respect is concerned, I'll just do a little bit more detail on each of the aspects. Respect, we look at the informed consent and we make sure that these are covered in the informed consent as well. Firstly, the participants, it must be voluntary. They must be not coerced into participation. They must decide themselves whether they would like to participate or not. All information must be provided in the informed consent document. Every information, don't leave anything out that can coerce the participants or they are not clear on anything and they'll sign something and realize later that this wasn't info, they didn't know about it. It must be verbally said to them and written. We say both, but if you can't do both, you can just do one, okay? You must also, when we say we can't do both, obtain before enrollment. In other words, you get these informed consent documents signed before you can enroll participants into the study. Exception with critical ill patients, that's very important, because if a person is critically ill, they don't know what's going on until they get better, and we do, if they are critical, they can be participating in a drug trial, whatever it is, okay? But we try to get the next of kin first to give sign the consent form. It must be in a language that the person can understand and appreciate. It must be to the same level. In other words, if it's communities outside, they've got no education, it must be very simple that they can understand the terms that are used as well. It must have cultural and community considerations. You must consider them very carefully when you're doing a proposal. And it must be reinforced annually. Also, if vulnerable participants are being recruited, you must make sure that you follow the correct procedure for them in providing informed consent. In other words, if they are mentally and physically challenged, these are vulnerable groups. Children, women, prisoners, depends which woman, in what areas, in which circumstances, soldiers, subordinates. In other words, if you're a lecturer and you got your students that you want to participate, you recruit into your study, that's very important. They are vulnerable groups. Orphans and critical ill patients. Okay, we'll do this more in detail later. When you talk about non-maleficence and beneficence, that's very important. We actually, the RECs actually screen this and see whether it is of beneficence or beneficial to the society or not, or the participant or not. And if we have conflict, we can actually ask others to review it first before it comes to a REC. In other words, you also might have got a process in place where it's reviewed, the scientific content is reviewed before it comes to REC, either departmental level or faculty level or whatever. Okay, there is another committee that looks at it. If it's just pure science, which is unethical, you must make sure that the standard of the science that you're using must be in such a way that it will cause no harm to the participants. In other words, there must be no psychological, they have some kind of a problem psychologically. When they participate, you ask them questions that it affects them psychologically, or it affects your whatever questions you're asking also, or if you're investigating or doing some research in the society, it might have some problems there as well. Or if it's any economic disadvantage that you can come across. But make sure that the standard is high, it's scientifically valid. That's very, very important. Justice, we all know about justice. The rights and welfare of all humans must be protected. Distributive justice is important. There must be equal distribution of both burdens and benefits. The study should leave participants better off, not worse off. In other words, the benefit must be more than the harm. Okay. I'm putting in a layman's term. Safeguard against the possibility of exploitation as well. You must consider vulnerable communities. Also ensure that research participants are treated with respect while contributing to social good. If a proven intervention is available, then it's unethical to use placebo controls. Okay, if you are going to use placebo control, these are more for clinical studies. Okay, so maybe you are not involved in clinical studies. If there were, you cannot use placebo. In other words, there's no treatment group if there is a proven intervention. But if there isn't, then you do drug trials. So you'll have a placebo group as well. You must, that's why I say you must justify it as to why you're doing the placebo group. You have a placebo group. There must be post-trial exercise. In other words, if you have a placebo group, when you finish the study, they must be provided with the treatment as well. There must be insurance cover for the participants. If they are injured in any way, they must be covered. Out-of-pocket expenses, now they must make sure that they are not paying for the cost of certain things. All right, when you're conducting your research. Thank you. Next one. Just to know a little bit about minors and assent, this is very important because you might be using minors, and we'll tell you what minors are and who are adolescents. You know adolescents already. But adolescent means a child between the ages of 12 and 17. So if they are going to participate, we'll go on to that just now. Minor means a person, a child, in other words, below 18 years of old. So anyone below 18 is a child. They can be adolescents or even younger than that. Assent means a minor's affirmative agreement to participate in research. Mere failure to object should not be interpreted as an assent. In other words, I'll carry on further, but then you can see from here what we mean by that, how we get participant, the assent from the minors. So when you conduct research on minors, important to note that you must get, firstly, parental consent from or legal guardian consent. Parental or guardian. So in other words, you will write to the parents or the guardian to ask them, you write to them to tell them you'd like to recruit these children to participate in a study. Maybe it's something to do with food or anything else, and you'd like to, or maybe they're pupils in school, they are school children, and you want them to participate in your study. You must write to the parents or the legal guardian first for consent. Now, if they consent, fine, they consented. If they consent, then you will also have an assent, a letter of information that we call an assent letter of assent. We have a simple terms for the child. If the child, say, is 12-year-old or maybe 11 years old, you must make sure the language is in such a way written that the child will understand what you're talking about and what study are you doing, why are you doing the study, for what purpose. They will decide now whether they want to participate or not. Okay, so when minors are recruited, so you should get both the consent from the parents and the assent from the child themselves. If the child says, no, I don't want to participate, you take the word of the child. You have to have both saying yes. Okay, that's what you got, the 3 bullets there. You can read it. Use of students, as Lisa, why I put this here, I said it's nice to know because we are in institutions where we got students, okay? And universities provide investigators with a ready pool of research partners, in other words, students. We've got students there, we can use them for a lot of research studies. But it's very important to bear these points in mind. Firstly, there should be no coercion. Another one is undue influence. In other words, you, the lecturer, is very important how you go about recruiting the participants. Also, power disparities. Obviously, you'll have the power over the children, the students. Selecting student participants must be fair. They might be voluntary in participation. They must decide voluntarily. It shouldn't be they mustn't be coerced. They must be provided all the information before they sign the consent. In other words, the letter of information must have everything there before they are asked to be recruited. These are very important because we use a lot of times students in our research investigations. So what we put down is very, very important. And also remember, they are a vulnerable group as well. They are a vulnerable group. And normally what we do is, if you're a lecturer and you are going to now, send a questionnaire out to students or interview them, we try to get an independent person to kind of recruit the participants so they can decide whether they want to or not. And also we try to also get an independent to even do the selection and interview if you can. Otherwise you do it yourself, but you make sure you are fair. All right, thank you. Next one is confidentiality of data is very important. Confidentiality. The DOH guideline describes very clearly identifiable data. In other words, your name, your date of birth, address, hospital number, mobile number, whatever you have, these are referred to as identifiable data because you can identify the participant. The next one is potentially identifiable data. In other words, you'll have the data of the participant, the researcher, but they will code it when they write up or publish. When they publish or write up their dissertation. But you can go back to the code and see which person said what. You can re-identify them. The other one is de-identified data. that cannot be traced back. They are anonymous, completely anonymous. So there's no codes, there's permanently removed. You don't ask them their date of birth, any personal details. You won't have anything, so you can't actually identify them. So there's 3 different categories. Sometimes you require that codes, the second potentially identifiable one, because you might want to go back to the participants for in certain cases. All right. So it depends, but you must give you a reason why you're using that. Thank you. The next one is important also. So all these things must be covered in your proposal, in your methodology. Data storage, very important, because the POPI Act is coming up also. So it'll be even more than what we have here, but what we have currently in place at the DOH National Guidelines recommends 5 to 15 years. In other words, whatever you've done, data that you've collected must be kept for 5 to 15 years. Okay. So in your research proposals, you have to mention this as well. Where you're going to, well, we'll go through that just now. The HPCSA guideline says 2 years. Okay. 2 years if you have published, and after publications, you just you can get rid of 2 years. Just 2 years require after, minimum of 2 years after publication. But if you have no publication, then you keep it for 6 years, and then you get rid of your data. How you get rid of your data is very important as well. I'll go through that just now when I'm doing the guidelines. Then the GCP guidelines clearly says that it should be retained for 15 years because these are clinical trials, South African good clinical practice guidelines, right? So that's SAGCP. So these are clinical trials. So if they clinical research, they should be retained for 15 years. But if it's on the open in the market, if it's something like drug or something is already in the market, it can be for 2 years, it's fine. Okay. Those are for clinical trials. But for each institution, we decided in a DUT that we should keep the data for 5 years. And right, but you can decide in your institution at Moses Katani Institute how long you'd like the data to be stored, 5 or 15 years. You can decide. All right, so we decided 5 years. We took the minimum. Also what's important is gatekeepers letter of permission. Now we call it gatekeepers letter, otherwise you can't collect data. Say you want to go into university, another university. You must make sure you get gatekeeper permission from whoever will allow you into that institution to collect data. It could be the registrar, it could be the research office, but you got to know who it is. If you're going to a school, it could be the school principal. If it's a clinic, it can be the director of the clinic. It could be a manager of a company. It could be a CEO of a company. It could be anything. So you got to decide before you can ask the participants to recruit in your study. You got to get gatekeeper permission first. Okay, that's also very, very important. And we'll go through when we do the guidelines. I'll go more detail on that. So these are all from the DOH guidelines. So I'm just going through that. Now what we are faced with. We are faced with a COVID-19 pandemic. That's something else. Now with COVID-19 pandemic, what's important to note from our side as researchers, that any adverse event, right, you can see from the SA Department of Health and the Disaster Management Act, it's laid down very, very clearly that all adverse events in any REC approved studies. In other words, it came to the REC, we gave them approval, but what happens when you collected data? When you were collecting data and you collected some data and then these participants or the researcher gets, or the participant becomes infected with COVID-19. That's an adverse event. That must be conveyed to the REC within 7 days, okay? Because it's an adverse event. While you were collecting data, this happened. So that must be reported and the institution needs to do something about it as well. Okay, but it must be reported while you were collecting data, this happened, because then you might have to just stop collecting data and not carry on any further. Okay, and then you can start later on again. So those are things that the institution will have some guidelines on that, what should be done thereafter. But it must be reported to the REC because we gave you clearance. Okay. Now, when proposals are sent to the RECs, how do they decide? What do they do? How do they have their meeting? How do they just look at the proposal? Firstly, people that sit in that committee, there should be somebody that has experience in that research area. In other words, they have experience and expertise. And there is a lot of deliberation, discussion, and disagreements, but we all come to a final decision at the end. We look at the risk-benefit ratio. We look at if it's appropriate culturally, and it's based on autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. So we look at all these aspects when we review proposals. Okay. The next point, this is important that I said we'll just look at the guidelines and a little bit more detail on that. Firstly, for everyone that's here, very important, these are things that you should cover in your proposal before sending it to the RECs. Your proposal must be completed according to the institutional guidelines. You have got guidelines and you must complete it according to that. Secondly, you must have a participant information letter attached if you're recruiting participants. There must be a participant consent form. Doesn't mean that it has to be filled in, the consent form. It must be a blank one, but it must be there, which you know that the participant, after they would read the information letter, they would sign. That must be attached as well. There must be the data collection tool, whether you're using a questionnaire, it must be attached. If using an interview guide, the list of questions must be also attached to the proposal. The broad questions, you can ask underpinning questions as well. The letters from researchers to the respective gatekeeper asking permission must be attached to the proposal. This is now requesting gatekeeper permission. Gatekeeper permission is obtained only after you get provisional ethics clearance. The copy of adverts that if you're advertising in any way to recruit participants, or you're placing it up in shopping centers or anywhere else, or maybe in the institution to recruit students, that copy of that advert must be also attached to the proposal. So we look at all these things. So your proposal firstly must have, but you're got guidelines, and this I just put here just for that the aims must be related to the title of the study. The objectives must outline the specific steps. You must outline the specific steps that you will take to achieve your research aim. Those are the objectives. The objectives normally define the what, the why, the who, when, and how questions. And the research questions are specific concerns that you will answer through your research investigation. Okay, so these are just broad, everybody would know, researchers should know this by now. The methodology is what we scrutinize at the RECs. We actually look at your population you're going to be recruiting, who you're going to be recruiting, what is the population, who are the population, how would you derive your sample size? If you've got a population, there's 500 or 250 staff members. Now you're going to do a quantitative study, all right? Your design, so you must have a design first. Firstly, your design, whether it'll be a mixed method or quantitative or only qualitative. Mixed method means both quantitative and qualitative. You got to mention that, your design. And then you'll have your population, your research population. Say the lecturers, you got 2,500 lecturers or 250 lecturers in this institution.